was a bit of a surprise when Duncan said, I've got something to ask you, and I thought it was another piece of work that he wanted me to do for SMA. And I was right, it was another piece of work that he wanted me to do for SMA. And so it is my very great privilege to have been asked to be your keynote speaker this evening. I'm going to talk about human stories, but I might not be going to talk about the kinds of human stories that you would expect me to. And I hope I'm going to entertain you along the way. We've seen a fair few representations of human beings in our presentations this afternoon, and I decided to use this as my introductory slide because it comes from one of my very favourite books that sits behind me on the shelf in the museum, which is called Our Ancient Monuments and the Land Around Them. And these are what people thought other people looked like in Britain in about 1812. It's one of the engravings. That book is a really useful book, but it's also got a human story that goes with it because somebody has taken a copy of that book and they have collected other kinds of maps, notes, postcards, lots of information, and they've used it as a scrapbook and they've added their part to the story, which is why it's a very special book to me, because somebody has added something to that story, and that's really the kind of thing that I want to talk to you about. Just to give you a little idea of where I come from, if you don't know me, I'm obviously from Bristol Museums. We're called Bristol Culture and Creative Industries these days, so really we need a new logo. Essentially that's museums, galleries, archives, film office, arts and festivals, and now the Bottle Yard Studios. So that's our service as part of Bristol City Council. And the two main museums, the two flagship museums are Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, which is up in the top left, just there next to the Wills Memorial Tower. That's how we tell people to find us. It's next to the big tower, not the thing that looks like a museum. And the one at the bottom, which is M Shed, which opened in June 2011. And that's our newest museum to our service, which is about what makes Bristol, Bristol. And we have archaeology displayed in both of those places, but I'll explain a little bit more about that. And in the top right-hand corner, we're also responsible for managing, maintaining, using, interpreting a Roman villa site, which sits in the middle of a council housing estate, just to the northwest of the city itself. So there are 4 of us in our team. We are the Archaeology and World Cultures team. So there's myself, there's Kate Isles, who's in the audience. We have Lisa Graves, who's a curator that specialises in world cultures. And I also have a Finds Liaison Officer. So we're fairly wide-ranging in the kinds of things that we do. Our collection goes back to before the museum collection. So our collections are based really around a selection of material that was formed by the Bristol Institute for the Advancement of Science and the Bristol Philosophical and Literary Society, who came together to form a museum. So we would call our foundation date 1823. But I know that our collections contain material that were excavated in the southwest by other people prior to that date. So, for instance, we have material from the Stony Littleton Long Barrow, which was opened in 1819. So we have some of the earliest excavated human remains. So we have human stories that predate the human collection, the museum collection. So I just wanted to say, we have a very large collection. It's nearly... Well, our museum usually says we've got 1.75 million objects, but the archaeologists amongst us know that we've got at least 1.75 million pieces of broken pot in boxes in our store. How do you count an object when it's an archaeological one and it's fragmented? So we have got several million items to look after. And so it might be somewhat surprising, therefore, to find that we don't actually have an archaeology gallery anywhere in Bristol Museum Service. These are 2 images of our previous gallery, and just to keep along with the orange theme, we will never have another gallery which is made out of orange Hessian, because essentially this gallery was all the earth colours. It was put together in the 1960s. It was put together with an academic audience in mind. You can see it is actually set out chronologically, and you have a pile of objects in the base of the case, very sort of space age style design, interspersed with panels of Hessian, black and white distribution maps, no images of people per se, except this chap on the right-hand side at the bottom, which I'll introduce to you a little bit more. and one other person, which I'll also introduce. It was literally falling apart when we took it apart in 2007. The glue was so brittle, those labels were falling down in the case on a daily basis. You can imagine that in that 40-year or so period that it had been in existence, that it was actually completely out of date. The design quality, the standard, the stories we wanted to tell about human beings or the human story in Bristol was just completely wrong. Completely wrong. And so it was quite right that it came down. Anyway, I promised you that I would introduce you to these two characters. So this chap on the left, this is what we thought, or somebody thought, whoever was firing a replica of the mere bow, which was in that case, looked like. Clearly, all prehistoric people had basin cuts. They dressed up in sheepskin. And what you can't see, but I know because the notes are in our files, is he's wearing bother boots and had complained mercilessly about the fact that he was getting nettled when he was having his photograph taken. This chap became iconic in the gallery, so much so that when we took the gallery apart, we had letters from students asking if they could have the panel to put up in their digs, and we said no because he's iconic to us as well. So he is actually by the door of our office and he's going nowhere. This person on the right, meanwhile, is clearly a representation of what all curators look like, or what everybody thought curators looked like in the 1960s. And this little man is about, I don't know, 1.5 inches tall. There were little versions of him glued all over the gallery. You can see the glue at the bottom. I've now got one of him glued to my computer to remind me that I don't actually look like that. And most curators do not look like that. We don't walk around in suits, and we're certainly not all male. So we've got representations, and it's how we present ourselves and how we change ourselves and our opportunity to tell the different types of stories. I've already told you multiple human stories about our gallery, this gentleman, and how curators don't look like this. The other place, of course, that most people get human stories is through the media. And at this point, I thought we might play a little bit of archaeology bingo about what you'd seen in the news this week. So hands up if you've seen a story about Tutankhamun in the last 2 weeks. Hands up if you've seen a story about some treasure in the last 2 weeks. Hands up if you've seen anything remotely to do with human remains, whether it's skeletons, ancient DNA, or Neanderthals, in the last 2 weeks. And what about Pompeii? Aren't all our sites compared to Pompeii in every news item that you see? So this is the kind of thing, we don't benefit from programs like Time Team anymore, which are all about the human endeavour to find out about the past. But we do get this. And of course, somebody has already mentioned Stonehenge this afternoon. And of course, where we live, it's not 1,000,000 miles away. And we get the word Stonehenge virtually every single day in our lives. So I just thought I would include a picture of Stonehenge so we can get it out of the way, because clearly the most important story about Stonehenge at the moment is to do with whether they're going to dig a tunnel or not. I used to do a lecture for the university about interpreting the landscape, and I actually used to have a picture of Stonehenge with a gif of a pink pig flying across it in terms of whether there would be a new centre for it. Well, we've got the new centre, but I think I'll keep that slide because it's about, are we going to get the tunnel or not? But Stonehenge is a really important, obviously it's an important site. It also gives me my favourite quote ever from Aubrey Burl, who, as a stone circle specialist, said, the thing about Stonehenge is it's like a dodo because it's of above average size, of peculiar construction, and represents a dead end in development. And the thing about it is it still captures everybody's imagination, and it's also a job creation scheme for just about everybody who works on it, because every time we find new evidence, we're having to rewrite the human story that goes with it. We are constantly dealing with new pieces of evidence which will change that. The other thing about this, and the really important thing for me, is that this is a contested landscape. We have our way of interpreting and engaging with the past, but so do many other people, and their ways aren't necessarily the same ways as ours. So if you've never read this book, I would recommend it to you. It's called Stonehenge Making Space. And the reason it's kind of important to me and to what we then went on to do in Bristol is because it was the first time that we were invited to participate in the display of an exhibition which was essentially not about the site itself, but how people connected with it. And it was put together with other people's voices. So this book is by Barbara Bender, and it's I'm going to read what it says. It's an imaginative exploration of a place that has fascinated, intrigued, and perplexed visitors for centuries. Instead of seeing Stonehenge as an isolated site, the author sets the stones within a wider landscape and how its use and meaning has changed from prehistoric times right through to the present. So essentially what Barbara did was she realised after the Battle of the Beanfield, and everybody had been denied access, particularly the free festivals had been denied access to Stonehenge in the 1980s, that she wanted to talk to those people about their experiences. She wanted to give them an opportunity to say what they felt about it. And if you think about it, somebody else has already used that word, co-creation. This is major themes, trends across all subject matter across museums at the moment. This is not peculiar to archaeology, but we co-create and we try to find ways of being inclusive and give other people voices and to take their opinions into account. And this was the first time really that I can think of. We also talk about user-generated content. So where you're collecting information from audiences, albeit on post-it notes, through iPads, or any other kind of electronic format, whether you're putting questionnaires out, user-generated content. And in this case, there were 9 wooden trilithons that were constructed by some free festival group goers, and they were populated with stories about their experiences from their perspective, about what they felt about the stones and the incidents. English Heritage at the time was also given an opportunity to participate. English Heritage decided that their PR office would actually be their voice in this. Barbara tried to be the archaeologist. You can see just there, she said, one of the labels that I've taken that quote from just there is what you're seeing here is an archaeological account of the site. It sounds very authoritative. Archaeologists don't usually on that they're not absolutely sure of their facts and that there are other ways of interpreting them. And you'll see on Trilithon 6, so that, as I said before, there were 9. We were invited to host this display in the front hall of Bristol Museum and Art Gallery in 1993. It was the first time that we'd done this kind of thing. There was an A-frame where people could write their comments. We had to moderate those comments because some of them were actually quite vile and violent. It was at a time where the Labour Council in the City Council was discussing whether we should have a free festival in the Bristol area and what we were going to do about traveller sites for people that were moving around the landscape. And that then led to somebody phoning the police about the fact that we'd hosted an exhibition where people had been enabled to give their opinion about an archaeological site and what it meant to them and the landscape and how they wanted to actually make contact with it. And I think this is what I was trying to get across when I wrote the abstract to this talk. People choose to make connections with the past, and we must enable them to make those connections at a level they choose. And archaeology is not just about archaeology. And as museum archaeologists, and I fundamentally believe that I am here to inspire people to do what they want to do with that subject. It might be to be an archaeologist. It might be to do something creative. It might be a source of, to do a painting, a poem, a piece of literature, a piece of fiction. It could be anything. Archaeology might be the root of that, but it's not for me to choose how they engage with it. I just need to enable it. So this led me to think about what I would tell you about probably one of the most bizarre situations that I found myself in 2015. So in 2015 in Bristol, this amazing structure was built in the remains of a bombed out church, Temple Church. And it was constructed out of reclaimed materials that had been found from all different types of development sites all over the city, and it was created as an auditorium. It was a contemporary artist called Theaster Gates. He's a potter, so bear with me. He's a potter, and I said I would surprise you, and I will, Duncan. the Astor Gates is a potter. And because he was a potter, the basic premise of this was there was going to be 24 days, 24 hours a day, performance space for people to provide some sound associated with the city. So it could be a marching band, it could be somebody singing, it could be any kind of noise associated with the city, and it was going to happen 24 hours a day. And people of Bristol were invited to ask for free tickets. So you could get a ticket at 3 o'clock in the morning and actually not know what you're going to hear for the next half an hour. And it was packed. All the tickets went. I was approached at the museum by a group called Pot Stop, because what they knew about Temple Church is that this is a whole area of production for pottery. And an acquaintance knew that I worked at the museum. They said, we'll take you to see Gail. You can get some inspiration from the pots in the museum. So they came down into my store and we started looking at all different kinds of pottery, and in particular a reference collection. So the Bristol Pottery Type Fabric Series, which is a unit of different fragments of pot representing the type fabric series for sites across Bristol. And each one of them has got a number which starts BPT. So it goes BPT1, and then it describes the fabrics, the forms, the inclusions. And when you read it, it has a rhythm. And so they came up with the idea that I would stand up as part of their soundscape to do with the making of pottery to read out the Bristol Pottery Type Fabric Series. And I thought, why would I say no? I've never done anything like that before. So I said, yes, I would do it. Their soundscape consisted of them taking a kick wheel into this space to make the rhythmic noise. Somebody was actually making pots. They had people slapping pieces of clay. They'd done oral history recordings of paintresses that had worked in the Bristol potteries. They had somebody who'd composed a piece of music. And then they phoned me back and they said, actually, we've been thinking about the Pottery Type Fabric Series. It's like, we thought it was a great idea, but actually, all those things you told us about potters and potteries in Bristol was really interesting, and we want to get that in. But we don't want it like a lecture. We don't want you to stand up and say something, it's like a lecture. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to be creative, because these people, a lot of the creative people, you just can't edit down what their thoughts are. So I went to the British Museum very early one morning, and as I sat in the garden outside waiting to go in, I wrote a poem. So I don't know that the keynote speaker for SMA has ever read out a poem that they have written, nor have they ever read out a poem about pottery. But it kind of sums up where I'm going to go to with the rest of this talk. So bear with me and I'm going to read it to you. I hadn't written a poem since I was at school when I did this. Pots speak to me of the past. They have a language of their own, through touch and texture, shape and form, through the stories that they tell, revealed by the real and the imagined. But which one should I choose for you? Which one would you like to hear? Is it of the potter who, having worked, won the clay, coiled, turned, pinched, prodded, stabbed and slashed it, to create bases that are frilled, handles like straps, and spouts with faces just like you and I? But wait, this one is a cow and that a monkey, so simply formed from a single piece of clay, and yet betrays our city's seafaring past, modelled on a sailor's exotic companion from a far-off place. Then there are the scenes, a stag with tongue protruding, wild eyes bulging, running for its very life, being pursued by a hunter, bow drawn and ready for the kill. Round and round the pot they go for all eternity. The stag never caught, an arrow never fired. Their story is wrought from nothing more than the strips of clay and a potter's imagination. Whose story were they trying to tell? Pots speak to me of the past, of the people who found them, sorted, washed, glued and researched them, and then placed them one by one in rank and file, on shelves, in boxes, in cabinets and cases, and helped the curious who were keen to learn more, matching the patterns, classifying the shapes, dating the forms and handling with gloves, carefully curatorial to protect them from us all, so they might live to tell tales in the future. Pots speak to me of the past. Their lives are now fragmented both by accident and by time, but still so many questions. Who dropped that pot down the well? Who poured the water from the jug? Who ate from that bowl? Whose finger made the spaces where I can perfectly fit mine? They are an unbroken line spanning thousands of years between me, those who made them then, and to those who make them now. Pots speak to me of the past and of today. So I took that to the pot stoppers. I stood up and read it out, and one of them burst into tears. I thought, that's not really the kind of thing that I was expecting. But actually what it does is it draws together that there are so many stories that an individual object or a site could tell, and all of those are human stories, and some people will be interested in more of those stories than others. So this is where a pot really does tell a story. This is not an ancient pot. It purports to be part of a cremation urn. And when I tell you that this cremation urn actually held the ashes of one of my predecessors at the museum, a curator called Leslie Grinsell, you'll understand why it tells a story. Because what it says actually written on the back is, this is part of a coloured urn especially made for the holding of ashes of L.V. Grinsell, obit 28th February 1995. Ashes taken to one of the 9 barrows on Mendip and scattered with ritual ceremony on the June 24th, 1995 by Nick Thomas and 15 to 20 friends. All arrangements made by Jim Hancock, who most befriended Leslie in his last years. This was sent to me through the post by the widow of Norman Quinnell, Henrietta Quinnell. And she'd sent me a note to say that he'd passed away and that he had a fragment of this pot. And he'd also got some papers to do with Leslie's archive. Leslie Grinsell was an expert in all of the barrows, particularly in southwest England, and one of my predecessors. And this particular ceremony had taken place. So, of course, I have actually got a pot that tells a story because somebody's bothered to write that on the back. The problem for me now is I want to know who came up with the ritual. I've got so many questions about how this actually came about, and also what trouble could those people get into for maliciously scattering human remains on an ancient monument. In terms of how we interpret the objects, though, one of the things that I started to think about in terms of the individual stories that objects tell about human beings really developed from the amount of experience you have of dealing with people who bring objects to the museum and how little relatively they understand or they look at those objects for themselves or the types of materials that they're made from. So the one on the top left is actually an example which is kept by the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. I suspect it might have been one that was sent a photograph. I was sent a photograph of several years ago. They thought that this was actually an object which had been shaped by human hands. But as you can see there, it's not. It's called a wind-polished pebble. And when I saw the picture, I looked at it and thought, I can't think, it has 3 sides to it. It's flat on the bottom, so imagine it's this sort of shape. I looked at it and thought, I can't think of any kind of prehistoric stone tool that looks remotely like this. I've never seen a 3-sided blah, blah, blah. So my head is doing all of the matching that I could possibly do. And so I gave it the picture to my colleague Roger Clark and instantly came back. It was called a dry canter. And a dry canter is evidence of an ancient desert landscape where the wind has blown across the top of a pebble and essentially polished it into this shape. And that led on to a whole conversation about how people perceive objects and how his experience of that helped him to identify it. And my experience helped me to say it wasn't made by a human hand, but the person who saw it assumed that it was. And how could we actually talk to people with our displays about when an object is an object and how you can actually start to find out things for yourself. The other classic was that we would very often get resin versions of the Lewis chessmen brought to us that somebody had bought in a car boot sale, and when you turned it over you could see all the little bubbles where the resin had popped the air bubbles as it had gone to settle, or it had got a casting line around the edge. Or you tell them that actually it was very warm to touch, it wasn't very heavy, all the things that we would look at and how could we do it. The object on the right-hand side is a piece of treasure that we acquired through the Treasure Act. It's a medieval silver gilt brooch. It's of a Scottish type. It dates to the end of the 13th and sort of like first quarter of the 14th century. And it was brought into the museum. And at that time, I was job sharing with a Scotsman. And we got the money to pay the reward from our friends group. And he asked me to present it to the friends group at their AGM because he couldn't be there that evening. And he said, I'll give you all the information, Gail. He said, but usually when I tell people about it, I tell them about the story of a Scotsman who decided that he's fed up of living in Scotland. He comes down to the Cotswolds because this was found in the Cotswolds and it's really rare Scottish thing to be found in the Cotswolds. He said he wears it until the pin's broken, falls off in a field until a metal detector comes to find it. And I flippantly turned around and said, do you want to hear the English version of that story? The English version of that story is an Englishman finds a dead Scotsman because he's been battling away with William Wallace. He steals the brooch, brings it back to give to his sweetheart. She wears it until the pin wears thin. It drops off in the field. It's found by a metal detector. And we used to laugh and joke about how our own perspectives would colour the way that we would interpret objects. And how are we going to actually represent that somewhere? So remember I said we don't have a gallery in the museum. We do have archaeological material on display. And some of our archaeological material is in this display, it's actually called the Curiosity Gallery. It's not the name of the gallery that we wanted to have. We wanted to call it Objectivity on the basis that we wanted people to be objective about objects. We did a huge amount of survey work with our visitors to find out, if we showed them images of the objects that we were choosing to put in this gallery, whose voice did they want represented? Was it an artist? Was it the curator? Was it a sculptor? Was it a historian? Whose voices did they want to see? It was quite interesting because the further back in the past that you went, particularly with the prehistoric material, they were very, very keen that it was the archaeological expertise voice they wanted to have. But they also offered other suggestions. And you can see it's a mixture of world cultures material and also archaeological material, and we used it to pose a series of questions. And you can see that the interpretation skirts, for want of a better word, that sit around the front have multiple perspectives loaded into them. One of the only objects which stays in this gallery, which was in the previous gallery, however, is this one. This has to feature in whatever talk I'm going to do about anything to do with the gallery, because it is my most favourite item in the entire collection for a number of reasons. So this is called the Poole Farm Kist Slab. So it's one of a series of 5 stones, which included the lid, of a stone kist, which was at the centre of a round barrow at Poole Farm at West Harptree in Somerset until the 1930s. And the reason that it was only there until the 1930s was because somehow the farmer managed to do a deal with the authorities. He wanted to plough out the barrow, because he wanted a nice flat field, and he was given permission provided an excavation could take place in advance of that. This is all written up. So the excavation took place, they uncovered the kist, they found the remains, cremated remains of an adult and a child. They've been radiocarbon dated, so we've got dates for everything. And then the stones were replaced by a replica on the site, on a flat field, and then this stone came to Bristol Museum. I don't know why the other stones didn't come. It wasn't until the 1950s, however, that anybody realised that those feet that you can see carved into it actually existed. And that's because somebody had found the carvings at Stonehenge. So everybody rapidly went around and looked at all the megalithic monuments that they got and realised that actually this is the only representation of any part of human anatomy that exists in a prehistoric stone carving, with one exception, and that's at the Calder stones. But you can see a series of feet. There's no other parallel in the archaeological record in Britain. There may be some Scandinavian origins, but nobody knows. And you can see there's also a series of cut marks, and there's a strange sort of anvil shape carving. Obviously, they were painted red so that people could read them in the gallery when they were put on display in the 1960s. And we've left it in there because this was one of the objects which was always going to go back into the gallery, and we asked the question and they said they wanted the archaeologist's perspective. So I give the basic information archaeologically. But we've also got a sculptor's perspective, and then there was an opportunity for people to add what they thought those feet represented. And I think, importantly, one of the things that I did was I did a whole session with some primary school children out at a school one day. And the first thing that we did was I asked them to write down what the questions they wanted to know the answers to. I gave them 4 facts. It's made of stone. It was made in the Bronze Age. It had human remains buried underneath it, for example. And I asked them what they wanted to know the answers to. And one of them said, if it's made of stone, why is it from the Bronze Age? Which led us into a conversation about the differences. So there are assumptions that you make when you're using the language. Then somebody said, why are there feet and no hands? And in the formation of the questions, they start to formulate possible answers. My second question to them was, okay, so why do you think somebody put the feet on the stone? And one little boy said, well, of course they represent a family because there's daddy, mummy, and baby-sized feet. And we went through all these things. Did it represent somebody walking? Was it a journey? And then another child said to me, actually, I think it looks like a prehistoric dance mat. And of course, yeah, prehistoric dance mat, could it be? And the interesting thing is, whenever you read any of the grown-up scientific interpretations of this stone, we also always have it's obviously representative of journey from this life to the next. But this child had decided that it might be movement that was actually being recorded on this stone. And that was a theory that nobody had ever come up with before. And really what we're doing in this gallery is explaining the answer to that question. You know, archaeologists aren't very good at saying they don't know the answer to everything unless they use the word ritual to explain something they don't know the answer to. And so in doing this, we put our visitors on the same level as us because we can never know the answer to that question and they can use their imagination. And the reason that is important is because that's what we do. We have some scientific information. We can be creative. And I'm just going to read something to you now from a recent review. So there's a recent review of a new book by an American called Charles Perrault, and he's written a book called The Quality of the Archaeological Record. And really, I think what I've not read the book, I've only read the review and had a conversation with the reviewer. But essentially what he's trying to say is that we shouldn't be looking for macro, normal human stories, that we're looking for much larger global and longer-lived stories. And Sue Greeney reviewed this, and she criticised, amongst other things, the author's suggestion that we should focus only on the questions that can be answered beyond reasonable doubt. So I think we might as well all just go home now, because archaeologists can't do that. She says, it is only by asking the unanswerable questions that we improve methodologies and techniques, and that archaeology should remain the unique combination, a discipline that mixes the findings of scientific endeavour with the imagination and creativity of the humanities. And that's what we do. And that's what we enable other people to do. So if we take that a little bit further, I mentioned MShed, and I was involved with all of the content development for MShed. And MShed is a thematic museum about what makes Bristol Bristol. We have about 350 objects. You can see the galleries. In the gallery that I'm responsible for, it actually has a plane hanging from the ceiling and all different kinds of bicycles, but it also has the earliest evidence of human activity. It has the Paleolithic hand axes from Chapel Pill on display. It also has material from a local Iron Age hill fort. It represents the story of some of our community activities out at Lawrence Weston at the King's Weston Roman Villa. It's people-focused and it's story-led. We were told when we were coming up with all the thematic content that we'd got to find the names of people. Well, obviously, for the vast majority of all of our evidence, we had never got the name of the person that would be attached to it or could even guess. So this is why this was important, because, you know, in my mind, the names of those people had to be the people that were associated with either the finding of the objects or the analysis of the objects, or the other kinds of communities that they would actually relate to. This is an image which appeared in the Evening World, which was a forerunner of the Bristol Evening Post in 1923. And it shows the unnamed gentleman in the newspaper finding 5,775 Tudor and Stuart silver coins. It's called the Welshback coin hoard. This was a plumber who'd been sent to find the leak underneath the floor of a banana warehouse down on the dockside where the custom house used to be. We know the name of the men in suits, but we don't know the name, or we didn't know the name of the finder. And obviously, the other thing we wanted to tell in Emshed is about the fact that we actually have, or potentially have, a franchise to collect treasure over and above the Crown, which was granted to us by Royal Charter about 500 years ago. So there were some important archaeological things we wanted to get out of this. Our record office was bombed during the war. I wanted to try and find out what the circumstances of this discovery was, because it was the last time we successfully exercised that right to collect treasure. And the reason was because the city clerk realised we had the franchise and rapidly fetched it back from London. Our records of all of that process were bombed and destroyed during the war, but I realised that because it had been treasure, there were going to be other letters that corresponded, and I found the file at Kew, and that's when I realised that his name is Francis Henry Smith, and he was sent to chase a leak in 1923, and unfortunately had no reward from the 5,775 coins that came out of the ground, because we exercised our right to collect. But his name was put back into history, and his story is the one that people will respond to, because as humans, we are interested in other human stories. So the way that we use archaeology in Emshed, for example, on the top left, that's a very small Venetian chevron glass bead. It was used as part of the slave trade. It's used in the story about Bristol's role in the transatlantic slavery gallery. Bottom left, this is a representation of Saladin. It's the earliest representation of anything to do with Islam in the city that's been found. It came from a 13th century Carmelite friary that was excavated. It's used in a case about faith. And when I talked to some Muslim children and told them about this mythical fight between Richard and Saladin, which never happened, and how Saladin always comes from the east and Richard comes from the west, I told them the story about chivalry. They said, we wished if we'd had a history told like that to us at school, that we would have understood more and felt connected to those stories. So this is not about it being a medieval floor tile at all. It's about the imagery that is on there that makes it an inclusive object within the gallery. And similarly, one of our prize objects, this is the tombstone from Sea Mills, which was dedicated to the daughter or wife or hope of Gaius Sentius. And you can see there's an image of her. She's got dangly earrings on, probably a fur hood, and a dog leaping from the left and a cock from the right. And this tombstone is not in any story about Roman Bristol, because there isn't a story about necessarily Roman Bristol in the gallery. It's about people who have come to the city, because we don't know who put that stone there and where Gaius Sentius came from. And it's actually in a case about migration and how we have been a multicultural society for thousands of years. It's not about the finding of this stone. One other important thing, though, to note is that we sometimes get to choose the themes that we express our human stories through, and sometimes we don't. We partnered with the British Museum on one of their national touring exhibitions. We were the lead partner. It went to 5 other museums. Unfortunately, they chose the themes, and those themes were these. First of all, we wanted to make sure it was inclusive, so we expressed that the Roman Empire, just about no matter where you lived, had actually been, you were involved within this. But these were the themes: power, influence, and people, which meant that it was really difficult for us to sell that to a regional audience, and particularly all those Key Stage 2 classes that wanted to learn about Roman Bristol. So we had to find other ways. But the reason I'm introducing this is because in order to find the voices of the people that were alive at the time, we resorted to using quotes from classical writers and historians and other people. And you can see, this is a big banner which introduced each one of the sections. And you can see that those quotes start to appear. It's something that we'd already done in Emshed in terms of altering the voice that's associated with the human story. We did it with Roman Empire, Power and People, and it worked. But if you look at lots of the other major exhibitions now, it is something which is happening all the time. So if you went to see the Celts exhibition at the British Museum, quotes all over the wall. If you went to see the Rodin exhibition at the British Museum, quotes all over the wall. And it's a way of people providing other people's voices. Then we come to another exhibition that we did in partnership with the Potteries Museum, and it was our opportunity to display 100 very small fragments of the swords that came from the Staffordshire Hoard. And we have a gallery this big and 100 objects this big, and we had to make an exhibition out of it, which actually really didn't exist. And what we wanted to play upon was the idea that we know the answers to some questions, but we don't know the answers to the others, and that we live in this kind of like twilight zone. And obviously at the time, Game of Thrones was very to the fore, and so we wanted people to get some kind of emotional response to this treasure. And we created a landscape, which essentially the gallery was painted black and it looked like a forest. And we gave some sensory sound effects. We wanted to have that experience where people just look over the shoulder because they think they've seen something. And it was a kind of awakening thing. And our 3D graphic designer said to me, 3D designer said to me, there's a layer of interpretation that's missing, Gail, because you always talk about the questions that you don't know the answers to being the most interesting questions, as opposed to the ones that you do. And that doesn't seem to appear. So can you go away and do something about that? And then he said, you know, it would be really good if you could find some quotes. Try and find some quotes for all of the themes that we're going on. And we're like, that's really an impossible task. And he said, why can't you be the person that says these things? And the thing, it struck me and I thought, why can't I be the person that says these things? And it's because we write ourselves out of these labels. We are given our label counts. My word count at the M-Shed gallery level is 60 to 80 words to carry an entire story. It takes away your voice. It's very, very dry. It's short, it's succinct, because we know people don't read labels. Generally, is it because they're short, succinct and really boring? You want to ask yourself that question sometimes. If it was a little bit more poetic, would it be? So actually, I did. And I also wrote another poem. I'm not going to read that one out to you today. But it's called Where Do the Warriors Sleep? And Where Do the Warriors Sleep featured in the exhibition. And it's the thing that we got one of the most lot of comments about because people related to it. I talked about, you know, at least by human breath. We don't know who is speaking their names. It was a way of getting all those questions we don't know the answers to into it, and also allowing me to be creative in a way that I couldn't be creative before, because we are completely hampered by all of those guidelines that we're given to write text. You know, we enable other people to be creative about our stuff, but we don't enable ourselves. So I thought I'd give a little bit of a case study now about two things that I've been working on recently where we are trying to reveal as many stories as we possibly can. And in this respect, I'm kind of taking my lead from a project that was done at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and it was a heavily funded project that looked at stories relating to their English collections. So it's called England, the Other Within, Analysing the English Collections at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And it was a project that was undertaken between 2006 and March 2009. We have this massive collection, 7,514 objects of mainly stone and bronze, which were collected from all over the world. They were purchased through auction, curio shops, farmers, all different kinds of people by this gentleman called Dr. Fawcett. He was independently wealthy. I could tell you a million stories about Dr. Fawcett to do with Roald Dahl, other collectors, the Mildenhall Treasure. I haven't got time to tell you all of those human stories about him. I could tell you the story about tromping across a churchyard in Yorkshire last weekend because I know his antecedents are buried in that church. What I'm going to talk to you about is actually what we've been doing with the Associated Archive and how we are releasing more and more stories that will enable people to engage with what we do. So this is just a short selection of the 400 and odd receipts that we've got for all the things that he actually collected. And they're all handwritten, which makes it really difficult for me to answer questions. If somebody said, I've got an ex-Fawcett item, because he sold things on as well. So the British Museum have got Fawcett items, the Ashmolean have got Fawcett items, the Getty have got Fawcett items. And they write to me and they ask me if I know anything about where he got them from. And so we decided that we would actually create just a really basic spreadsheet of all the information that was. This is just a short part of the information. There's actually about 27,000 pieces of data that we've got from the 400 receipts. and now it can be sorted. And if you're interested in the whole of the project, I did a public archaeology Twitter conference paper on it for Public Archaeology Twitter Conference 4, so you can read the whole of the project. But fundamentally, what I've now got is something which gives me a way of researching those object histories in multiple ways. And these are the main areas that are coming out. So it's all the people that they would previously belong to. What the object history was, do we know if it's been published anywhere? Who were the dealers that were dealing? What was the art market like, because we've got values? The archaeological context that they came from, because some of them were excavated and they are published. And then one of the most interesting ones, which most people will go for straight away, is the fakes, forgeries and fame, which led me to this. This gentleman sitting in the corner, that's the only picture that I can find of him, is somebody called Captain John Ball. And Captain John Ball was a collector, and there is a huge amount of material in Fawcett's collection that came from an ex-Captain John Ball collection via the forerunner of St Albans Museum. And what I want to know is, why did they come out of St Albans Museum, and why did we have them? And who was Captain John Ball? And eventually I came across an article that had been produced in the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, written by somebody called Mary Cahill, who'd done the most amazing piece of research across a huge number of documents about something called the Strangford Lock Hoard. And to cut a very long story short, the Strangford Lock Hoard was a collection of fake gold items acquired by the National Museum of Ireland in 1914, and they'd come originally from Captain John Ball. And the long and the short of it was, she managed to show through all the documentary evidence by looking at all of the papers and things like that, that he was the chief protagonist, and it had probably been some kind of prank on a dealer that he'd fallen out with. Other stories about John Ball: he was a major arms dealer, that's how he made his money. A lot of his collection was on loan originally to St Albans Museum. But what Mary Cahill was then questioning was whether there were other fakes and forgeries that had gone into other museum collections. The National Museum of Ireland did a whole big consultation and essentially had to, what the curator at the time wanted to do was melt them down, turn them into bullion, sell the bullion off so that they could buy more objects, and that's what they did. But the only reason that Mary Cahill could put any of that together was because there was a documentary record. There were original letters and documents spread across other museums to be able to put that story together. And of course, the first thing I wanted to know then was, did we have anything from Captain John Ball that wasn't actually real, that was in the Fawcett collection, and how would I find out? And I think we don't, because mainly the forgeries were gold, and we don't have any gold objects in the Fawcett collection. Just in case you were wondering that archaeology was all about men and not about women, I thought I'd put this up just here in terms of a human story. Dina Portway Dobson Hinton. Dina Portway Dobson, as she formerly was an excavator in Bristol in the 1930s, and she excavated some of the Roman sites in and around where our major Roman site is of Seamills, the Roman town of Abono. There's quite an interesting obituary of her in the University of Bristol Speleological Society, because she was also a caver. A major archaeological work was the Archaeology of Somerset, which was produced as part of the county series. But really, in her obituary, what it says there is her most important work was the inspiring of the younger generation. She started Philip Raats and George Boone on their careers. And I think that's what we do. We enable people to be inspired to do things. She enabled George and Philip to go off and become archaeologists. In fact, George Boone started off when he was about 16, looking over the fence while she was excavating. Not quite a story similar to Ken Barton looking down a hole. But he started to engage with the archaeologists, and then he got involved with the museum. And we've got a whole, show you a picture of him. This is George Boone. Became the head of archaeology at the National Museum of Wales. I won't tell you about the story when he fell asleep when he interviewed me once, but he did. You can ask me about that later. George Boone, when he was 18, went on to excavate King's Weston Roman Villa, which is a site that we're responsible for. He did so because he'd been interested by all the work that Dina Portway Dobson had done, and because he had been involved with the museum. And he wrote a letter to the city engineers and asked if you could follow all of the diggers that were digging out the service trenches as they were creating a new housing estate These children did actually dig on the site, but this is a posed photograph, again, for the Evening World. It was dug with children from Fairfield School and volunteers from the Clevedon Archaeology Society. This is what the site looked like. This is all the paperwork that goes with it. There's a huge amount that I've discovered, and I've only discovered it because we've got volunteers, and volunteers like Steve. And Steve comes in once a week on a Friday, and he started to create me a great big database of all the information that is kept within those files. And I hear him chuckling in the corner, and I'll say, what are you laughing at? And he'll say, God, it's amazing. He said, it's such a different world. He said, they talk about the fourth inst. They use words like ultimo. They talk about, they talk about themselves like, Walker, I'm doing this. They only ever use the surnames. He said, it's a completely different language, and it's so rich, and he's completely inspired to read more. And we don't write like that anymore, and I'm not sure that he would read one of my emails and have exactly the same reaction to it. How do we get that kind of information into archaeological archives? So one of our remits is that we collect material which is representative of a site. We collect the records that help us to understand that site. There's been a basic disconnect between the work that museum archaeologists do and commercial archaeologists, in the sense that there are very few people like me now who actually go out into the field to dig. Most of the records that are made now about the process of that excavation are digital. And in fact, as far as the Mendoza Review is concerned, museums should be relieved of curating the digital record about the site itself. So all of that should go to ADS because they can curate it. What I'm interested about, though, is that social history record that goes with those digs and why we are not collecting that. Because if we want people to connect with the past in the future, that's what we do. That's why we collect archives, so people can look at it again. We are not actually collecting any of the social history that goes with it that might be of interest to people who are not archaeologists. This is Barras. This is Andy King with the green hat on just here. They went to dig on a site just at the back of the museum. It was a Civil War fort. And basically, Andy said, finding the cannonball was really exciting. It was a bit like looking for the Holy Grail. I mean, how could we dig a Civil War site and not find such an iconic object? I needed to tell this story in M-Shed. I had no personal account of what happened. We don't actually have a personal account of what happened from the perspective of the people who found it. And those are the stories that other human beings make connections to. If you look very carefully, the person with the lots of curly blonde hair is actually me in 1982, and it does prove that I did go out on site and get dirty before I decided I wanted to work in a museum. This site is Crickley Hill. So Crickley Hill, Iron Age hill fort. More than 5,000 volunteers from around the world worked on this site between 1969 and 1994. So 50 years ago, they started to dig on this site. And I was just one of those people as a student. It was a Nottingham University thing. This blog that's been produced by Julian Parker started because people wanted to have a reunion about that site, and then they started to offer their memories. So in that sense, it's a kind of reverse. They're offering their perception of what it was like then. And that has grown and grown and grown and grown. And every time I look at it, there are more reminiscences about the site, including lots to do with these. This is a Civil War. It was a civil defence site called Ullenwood Civil Defence Centre. It was where we had to stay when we were diggers. It's also, it was kept there because it was on the site of a nuclear bunker where the government would go to should there be a nuclear war in the 1950s. That nuclear bunker has been destroyed now. And what it made me think of was this. So this was a tweet that Dr. Rachel Pope had put out. And what she said was she's working with a group, Penny Clothii, is that right? I asked Elizabeth how to pronounce that earlier, on a hill fort. And I saw this, and this is an artefact. This is something human hands have made. And if we start to record everything digitally, which is what is happening on archaeological sites, we will never get this in our collections. We will never be able to connect people with the personal human hand which has made that record. Now, I'm not saying that we should make everybody draw everything on permatrace again, but what I'm saying is the way that we are recording means that we are dehumanising and depersonalising the records that we are collecting of archaeological archives. So I asked her if she could send me a picture of the whole thing. She said it's fascinating how many different people's pencil lines are on this single drawing object. 100 people or more made this particular picture. You would never get that in a report. And there's one thing that sticks in my mind that Duncan always says. Duncan says when you get to a report, you should actually be collecting all of the thought processes that get to that final point in terms of the archive. It's a bit like doing your maths exam and you have to show your workings. You have to show your workings, and this is the working. So there's a picture of it. She just pinned it up on the fence so that you could see it. And these are some of the students, the site matrix. Look, we draw out our understanding of the past, manually constructing time. And to finish, I'm just going to finish with an item which is pinned up at the back of my desk. And this is a piece of paper which came from a whole set of files when one of the previous directors of the museum, was also an archaeologist, had left. And we got left a whole load of files and we said, do you want to go through these because we're going to bin the rest of them? And this was in the bin pile. And I looked at it and said, hang on a minute, that's got Mortimer Wheeler's signature on it. That's not just any ordinary letter, it's a Mortimer Wheeler letter. And so I kept it, and it's pinned up on my desk, not because I'm a Mortimer Wheeler fan necessarily, but it's just this tangible bit of evidence. And Mortimer Wheeler, it could be anybody's signature, but Mortimer Wheeler actually wrote that name on that piece of paper. And when I show it to somebody else, oh, it's Mortimer Wheeler, it's like, you get, wow, that's amazing. Whereas I think if I did a photocopy of that, I wouldn't get the same response because there's no human contact in a digital record. So my challenge to the sector is we interact with other people through social media, through blogging, through all of the letters that we produce during the course of recording or collecting. We collect some of them, but we are missing a trick. We are missing a trick which will enable people in the future to connect with us as human beings who are responsible for connecting other people in museums with archaeology. So I want you to go away and think about how you will solve that problem. I've already got one solution. I'm going to be working with Wessex Archaeology to look at some of the bigger sites and see how we can actually archive all of the social interaction that goes on with a big excavation. I'm not saying that we should do it for watching briefs. I'm saying we should do it for selected sites, because if we are going to collect an archive which is representative of a site, it should represent the people that made it. Thank you.